such a pleasure to be here. We started off with such a big bang, to use geek jokes, that it's going to be a very hard job to follow. And I'm only afraid that, to quote T.S. Eliot, which might be a slightly different paradigm, that I might end with the whimper. Now, there have been so many things said. I wish that I had a lot more in the presentation, but I already have too much in there. I will just say some questions were raised, and they're questions that I am going to try to answer. Might not be perfect answers, but I certainly believe that we can't just say, well, we're just building the technology, or that the technology is neutral. I think that for everything we build, we must know how to, let's say, design it appropriately. I was going to say find the on-off switch, but that's actually a pretty basic principle. I was one of the ones that traveled far. You know that lovely image of the Swiss village? I think that was actually where I was yesterday. And it was called Walserhus-Sürtig, and it looks exactly like the photo I have on my Instagram, if you doubt me. But what I was doing there, I was part of a multidisciplinary group of people trying to crack the neural code to develop human-level artificial intelligence. And why I joined that group is because from the outset, they said it's not enough for us to bring the best AI theorists or the best neuroscientists, but we must try to bring a group that is going to somehow work together that includes evolutionary biologists and computer scientists and ethicists and anthropologists, because, you know, there's not a lot of difference between the behavior of single-cell organisms and the behavior of primates and humans at certain levels. And, you know, perhaps if we were able to develop an understanding of intelligence at the level of, say, a worm or a mouse, then we would have solved many of the fundamental problems of the last 50 years. But I've heard a lot of people over the last 50 years saying we're going to crack AI. And I found it very disappointing. In many ways, it's a whole nother talk. But I was actually going from Switzerland to Australia, where I'm part of the International Robotics and Automation Conference, the first time one of the major research conferences has been held in Australia. And it's like, how do I break the trip to just drop into Tucson for a day? Because I almost literally was flying overhead. But I want to start in a slightly different fashion and talk about empathy, which for me is a very active word. Okay? I was made to think of a couple of examples. So empathy is not just understanding and sharing feelings. I think it's also the ability to put that into action, to use it to change our frameworks. And we confuse that a lot with sympathy. So we think that empathy is feeling sorrow or pity or fear. That's sympathy. And it's actually very selfish, because that only relates to our feelings about a perceived situation. And empathy is a vastly more active and more interesting word, because it relates to us trying through some processes to develop a theory of mind, to understand what is happening for another person or being of any kind. So let's talk about AlphaGo and Lee Sedol. For all that those were fantastic achievements, do you think that perhaps Lee Sedol had a cup of coffee during his games? After all, he did 5 matches. And maybe he actually got up and went to the restroom because of all the coffee. Okay? So do you think AlphaGo would do that? At this point, I would say never in a million years. You know, maybe only 500,000. Because all of those things that a human does at the same time as playing Go, we can't come anywhere near developing any, whether it's using recursive neural networks, whether it's using the latest quantum computing software, we are nowhere near being able to develop that parallel ability to stand up to navigate, to walk around, to breathe, to drink, to have a conversation on the way to the restroom and back. So right now, where our artificial intelligence is at is, for all that, there were really exciting new developments. So now if you are how would you say, an expert in the field of Go, you now look at the new moves that AlphaGo developed, and it completely changes how you think about that game. But if you changed the size of the board from 19 squares to 18 squares, do you think Lee Sedol would still be the world's best player? Yes. And he would comprehensively beat AlphaGo because that machine would not be able to play simply by reducing the number of squares on the board. It would have to re-go all of the training that led it to there. So there's a transferability in human knowledge that no matter how good we're doing some artificial intelligence, we're so far away from doing. So for me, this is the fascinating question, because machines think in a vastly different way to the way that people think. And yet people often think about machines as if they were people. And that's perhaps the key message of the talk. But let's take a little bit of a road trip to get there, as came up in the introduction. I grew up in a kind of physics family. I used to build the lab equipment, the physics department. My father was an astrophysicist. My mother developed the first computer systems for the university libraries and did the first networking of them. I was the classic geek girl. When this photo was taken, not only could I name all the dinosaurs that existed, and I so relate to the first speaker saying I was either going to go into paleontology or astrophysics. Like, what other choices were there? I could also identify every single plane that took off from Christchurch University, because I don't know what this means genetically speaking, but my father was a bit of a plane spotter, and he taught me that. I can't anymore. But even at that age, while I was identifying every plane that took off, and every dinosaur that ever lived, and all of those wonderful things, I couldn't help but wondering why I, the older child, the prettier and more intelligent child, was the hostess and not the pilot. I have never, ever gotten over that. The Model Rocket Club, the same story. I was always the only girl in the room. And my achievements were not measured on a scale of what a wonderful rocket you built, but what a wonderful thing that a girl is building rockets. Now, I was building the best rockets, so again, what I wanted to do was to be Valentina Tereshkova, the first female astronaut, and often forgotten these days. I applied to NASA, and for those that have seen the recent history, this was just after the 13 Mercury women had been ditched out of the program, and at the tender age of 10 or 9, I, like Hillary Clinton, received the, I'm sorry, but NASA will not accept you unless, of course, you happen to be an Air Force test pilot. And they only take men. Which I thought was a kind of dodgy way to get out of saying, I'm sorry, we've changed, we're just not going to have women in the space program, but nonetheless, that was the case. And it had such an impact on me, it made me change what I was going to do, which in hindsight was a bad decision, because by 1978, the first group of female astronauts was being employed, and they were partially based on their scientific training and not on their Air Force Top Gun status. But this was what I see whenever, and I tell you, if you ever search for women robotics engineers, you'll find the same thing. You will find a lot of male engineers building female robots. This is what we thought women and the space race was. So, another brief digression. And this is really a good time for the road trip, because I lived here for a year in 1971 while my father did a sabbatical at Steward Observatory here at University of Tucson. And is there anybody here who remembers Frank Lowe? scarily, it's possible that some of you might, and that would be absolutely wonderful. He sadly passed away about 9 years ago, and my father passed away 2 years ago. And it makes me really, really sad, because I would have loved to go back to see him at Christmas time and say, hey, Dad, if you Google Stewart Observatory and Keay, guess who comes up? Yes. But while my father was here, he was involved in the first infrared mapping of Jupiter. And so I spent a lot of time at Kitts Peak and at a lot of the radio telescopes through my childhood. And this was the paper that he published in 1973, or at least one of them. I found it really, really hard to find these records. And it was visualized on the cover of one of the big magazines like Nature or Science as this. We could use all of that data about the electromagnetic spectrum, about the infrared radiation, and we could convert it into a way that made sense to everybody in understanding what was happening in the solar system. And this is the most recent picture of infrared mapping of Jupiter. Just had to throw that one in there. But my life goals, clearly, my life goal was to be an astronaut. Why? It wasn't just the great fashion, okay? But you understand I did have a spacesuit, and I had built myself a console for a replica console for the Gemini cabin. And I did have a model lunar lander. And somewhere under the house in Australia, we do still have all of the NASA PR from the Apollo missions, typewritten, because my dad was able to be a correspondent there, and we actually came over for one of the launches again, probably 72. But it wasn't just the technology. It was the way we could use that technology to meet alien life and to attempt to communicate with it and understand it. Slight detour. Seeing as NASA didn't want me, I became a little bit anarchic, rebellious, and spent a few years acting and playing music and generally being a little bit punk. And then I decided to have a real career because, certainly my parents never really expected me to get a real career after that. And I became a technical trainee for the ABC in the fields of television, film, and radio. And I spent 3 years learning how to operate everything from the satellite equipment down to the old school physical splices for the film. And that was fantastic. We were on the transition from analog to digital, from film to, not just from film to video, but from using digital effects in the studios rather than analog kind of switching. And this was not that long ago. It was in the 80s. But did you notice the similarity between that and mission control? I've had so much trouble explaining how I went from doing film and television to doing robotics to people. But when I look at the photos of what I was working on, it becomes clear to me that what I did was I went for the most creative, advanced technologies. And the key thing was it was creative and it had global scope. Robots were only in the research labs. This was equipment that had impact on the lives of millions and millions of people. Next, digression. So I had children and I did a lot of work building computer networks and getting particularly non-profit organizations onto the internet because it was clear that that was where you needed to be in the future. But, I did realize that for all these years, I was the alien because I was the only woman in the room. And this is where the title of my talk was being the old woman in the room. And age for me now is such a blessing because I have experienced several waves of technology hysteria where we've promised all sorts of amazing things and then we've worried that it was going to destroy society. And I've actually seen what happened. And I look back, I've been a real student of the history of technologies. And we've had many revolutions, and there are certain common threads in them. But right now, as people, who thinks things are getting better? Okay, it's kind of like who's an optimist and who's a pessimist. But, you know, we've been talking about equality for how long? Since when? You know, anybody want to know which is the first country to give women the vote? No, actually, I was born in New Zealand, and it was New Zealand over 100 years ago. Do you know what the last country in the world to give women the vote was? Switzerland, in the 60s. You know, and I think most of us go, you're kidding. That's not that long ago, okay? But around about then, in the 70s, we believed that there had been this wave of codifying gender equality. That meant that all I had to do was study and apply for those jobs, and then apply for those promotions, and I would no longer be discriminated against. Well, you know, a strange thing has happened since then, and we have the figures to prove it. Some fields continued to increase their diversity, and some fields actually went backwards. So your peak female computer scientist period was 1970. And since then, the number has gotten less. And you can drill down into that and say, well, there's probably quite a few other factors, but one of the factors is the status of the job. The reason that there was peak women in that field was this was a period when the physical hardware was still considered the harder part, and that being involved in the programming was seen as a little bit of an extension of the secretarial pool. You know, women could do all the software. Men were doing the soldering. And as the status of those roles have changed, it's funny because in both law and biology, women have continued to increase their representation. But in computer science, that's gone backwards. And in many areas of finance as well. So I do believe that these are cultural phenomenon. This was 1967. This was 2012. And for all that there are a lot of fantastic women in astronomy, in computer science, in robotics, and in AI, you just don't see that many of them. The statistical, it's about 5%. So I am committed to changing that. If I do nothing else with what I do, I'm able to put into play some initiatives that I can speak up about and try to make whatever changes that I can. And if we want to talk more about this at another time, it's not just one thing that you have to do to change things. You have to change the whole process from advertising through to promotion and assessment. You have to change language. You have to change a lot of underlying assumptions, but you can do this. It's just you can't just fix one thing. And perhaps the key question to say here is that what makes us think that this is a woman's problem? Okay? This is a problem for all of us because we simply do not have enough intelligent people doing creative things with technology. And we need that for the world to progress. So this was my life goal. It became building the alien, not going into space to find it, because I realized that alien was a concept that we already had on Earth and that we were now starting to be able to do technologically. As you see, Robonaut and real astronaut. Robonaut is better equipped to work in space because space is a very dangerous environment, and the radiation, certainly among many other things, i.e. sudden death from decompression, extreme cold, but particularly the radiation means that even if you solve all the other things, we haven't really worked out how people can stay in space for very long. But we're building these robots and you say, I don't know that I've really seen them. And why am I interested in robotics now? Because now we've had 50 years of robots in the factories and they've been behind fences. They've been doing dirty, dull, and dangerous jobs, and that's over. We now have collaborative robotics that through a combination of sensors and actuation are able to be things like back-drivable joints. Things like smaller and lighter robots so that you simply don't have to deal with the inertia, the inertial mass. We have collaborative robots is what this new trend is called. We also have affordable robots and we have social robots. And the reason we have these is because they're becoming affordable. And I'm going to go really quickly through this because we've already heard a little bit about this phenomenon of the democratization of technology, where you start with a $1.4 billion autonomous vehicle, the Cassini spacecraft, and then you have, 12 million per Predator drone, and then you get down to, they're at Costco. Everybody has them under the Christmas tree. You get an autonomous drone for $200-300, to the point where you get these tiny little drones, which are still maybe remote operated right now in the mall, but in the research labs are capable of autonomous operation, down to the size of 1 centimeter. So we go from this picture, and this is an Australian robot, a fully self-driving truck, and Australia's had these for 15 plus years, maybe 20, to these. And this is a robot truck that you might see on the roads in states around you. Utah, Nevada, definitely Florida. Just, FYI, if you're saying, hold on, they're testing self-driving vehicles everywhere, where don't I go for a holiday? Okay? Florida's not such a great place right now. And it's really interesting ethical decisions around this self-driving vehicle space, because on the one hand, these are really needed commercially speaking. You say, well, what about all those poor truck drivers? Do you know the greatest job vacancy right now is long-distance truck driving, because it is such a dangerous, dull job. So every click on buy it now that we do on Amazon, we kind of put one of these into play. So maybe we need ways to save energy, ways to make it a more efficient practice. But then here's the flip argument. If something goes wrong with that, do I want to be on the same road? 80 miles an hour? 80 tons? Yep, no. I like Waymo a lot better. But, we've got these battles right now about, do we create dedicated lanes on the highways? How do we slowly guide self-driving vehicles in with human drivers? Because human drivers think very differently to self-driving cars. And arguably, some of the complex environments for these vehicles, the city streets, where everything is chaotic. If you look at it as an engineer, you'd say, put them on the highways, you can have dedicated lanes, and we're already pretty much doing that with kind of lane assist and cruise control. But if you look about it in terms of, well, what's the worst that would happen in a crash? Then you think maybe putting them into those can't go faster than 25 miles an hour scenarios, even if it's a far more chaotic environment, makes more sense. So one of the key things in this ethical battle is right now there have been 2, maybe a few more if you count China, fatalities. 3 in self-driving vehicles that I know of right now. Yet there have been 24 fatalities in the last 2 years from carbon monoxide overdose from people with automatic door openers for their cars. That's an autonomous system killing us. But it doesn't strike the same level of fear or terror. I don't know why. But that's really at the heart of our ethics and all of those silly trolley problems, which, I think ethics is great, but trolley problems don't help anything. Where you have to weigh up what are the values of these technologies compared to what are the costs. In general, driving is getting safer and safer. It's the devil in the details. So you may have seen this self-driving technology. There are now so many of these in the Silicon Valley area that San Francisco has gone for a ban on sidewalk delivery robots. But the startups just said, that's fine, we'll go to Redwood City. So, talking about robots, the first thing we think of when we talk about robots is that we think about humanoids. And if you know the Gartner hype cycle, To me, they are at the peak of the overinflated expectation. Where we are, in general, we've already got mass automation. We're starting to get teleoperation of manipulation and some mobility, but these have to be quite simple systems, because this is what the most sophisticated humanoids in the world look like. And this is from the DARPA Robotics Challenge in 2015. And this is actually the most widely viewed video from any of the DARPA projects. So, you know, definitely compared to, say, the winning robot. And it's the best PR move they ever made. Now, have any of you seen the fantastic videos of Boston Dynamics robots doing backflips? Right, that's one of them. Okay, so yeah, it does amazing backflips in the video, carefully curated and controlled. This was in the wild. Now, admittedly, they have improved the robot since then, but the Atlas from Boston Dynamics was the base robot platform for this challenge. And the two winning teams did not use that platform. They did not use that platform either. That was a very disappointing Japanese robot. But you know, the whole reason for this challenge, it wasn't to build humanoids, it was to build robots that would be capable of solving disaster situations. This was modeled on the Fukushima nuclear reactor shutdown procedures. 24 hours could have prevented the nuclear disaster. But it was so dangerous that nobody could get in there. And everybody said, Japan, where are the robots? Well, they're still not there, okay? Where we are right now is what is called a Cambrian explosion of robotics, but they're far less sophisticated. Some of them are as kind of simple as snake robots, or they're robots with wheels, or they're robot arms, but it's very rare that they're put together. It's really about specialization in one physical form or another. So did I mention that there are 50 self-driving companies testing in California right now? Okay. One of them is doing a self-driving grocery cart. Some of the other examples that I'm just checking how I'm going for time because there's so much I want to say and I can get really stuck on some of these examples. That one is cute. What I love is that for each of the photos that I show you, there are a half a dozen others. And I had to hold myself back from being repetitive. So these are some of the earliest models of autonomous delivery. They're not good, okay? It was great advertising for Domino's, I'll have to say, but it's a little bit, the technology was not really there yet. The technology is, just a few years later, rolling out. And while delivery is not the right thing to do with drones of this size, these drones can be really, really good at conducting inventory and doing surveys, particularly in a warehouse type environment. Where, did you know 60% of all warehouses still use paper documentation for their inventory? Okay, but we're getting to the point now where we're going to put codes in or on everything, whether it's a barcode, a QR code, or RFID tags. Amazon has patented an idea of doing drone delivery with giant blimps. In fact, they've patented a lot of ideas like that. And you go, well, it's speculative. All of the big five are patenting a lot of very speculative moonshots. But I'm not going to show it. I'm working with two startups that are doing large-scale drone delivery right now. And what I like is, and this has just come out in the last year, Kiwi robots were pretty poor featured until they got their funding. This is a Berkeley University startup. And after their last round of funding, just a couple of months ago, they've released this prototype. They now have 3 different sorts of autonomous robots that are able, in each case, to work with a different situation. And therefore, together, they have become far more economically feasible. They're starting to provide potentially a value for a restaurant. And it's not simply a publicity exercise. Although that trike, yeah, that's publicity. it's gotten to the point now. Do you remember when robot vacuum cleaners and iRobot was pretty much, they were the robot vacuum cleaner maker? And then a few more companies started making them. Well, robot vacuum cleaners are now 25% of the global vacuum cleaner market, which means that every major consumer electronics company has a line of robot vacuum cleaners. That's what's important about this, not the robot per se, but the fact that this is what LG unveiled at CES this year. Every major consumer electronics manufacturer is now putting their bets on their line of service robots, home robots, and robots that we call them service robots because you might not own it, but you will pay it for the services that it does you, as it's collecting your luggage or doing your grocery to the car delivery, or all of the other tasks that these robots are being designed to do. And indeed, this is part of a line of robots that LG has, which to my mind really quite center around the smart hub, the social robot hub. And to me, I call Amazon Alexa and Google Home robots. They're at the less featured end of the spectrum, all the way up to mobile home robots with faces and more features. So you see commercial delivery robots, mainly doing inventory management. Mobile manipulators, they're not even over the peak of hype yet. Basically, it's like the old engineering joke, you know, do you want fast, cheap, or good? Pick two. I would even argue, if you're looking at robots, pick one. You know, you can do mobility or you can do manipulation. Don't combine those things. So this could just be a mistake, or it could be a video that's not playing. It's probably a mistake. What you're seeing in the last 3 years is the development of a range of robots for logistics. You might not see those directly, but almost all warehouses now have them. It's taken about 5 years since Keay Systems was bought by Amazon, but now every major retailer is buying a company to do this kind of back-end logistics. And you may have heard Walmart is rolling out 50 of these robots for their stores. What you didn't realize is that there are 5 or 6 other companies that are being rolled out in all of the other major retailers. And these are robots that you will see as you go up and down the aisle doing your shopping. They could work at night, but they also work at day so that they don't have to deal with getting in the way. Actually, it's not so much about understanding the images that they're collecting for inventory. You could design them to do that at night, but at night you put the stock restocking on, and that's actually harder for a robot to navigate around. And some people will say, wow, they're just starting with inventory, soon they're going to be stocking the shelves. But they're not, because robots do inventory 10 times better than people. Even people with RFID scanners and cameras going up and down the aisles. People get bored and people get distracted. The results here are 40% more accurate. So you can imagine the amount of shrinkage and restocking this allows each retailer to do, and they're all fighting for low margin work. So you don't say that the robot is taking a job. You say that these robots are now allowing retailers to remain competitive in their pricing and to keep their stores open. And you don't put an arm on that robot so it can stock shelves, because it's going to do it at half the pace of a minimum wage person. And it's not going to do it as well. So I see this as an ongoing split between the robots taking tasks, not jobs. And we just have to work out, here's the task that the robot does well, and then here are all the rest of the things that constitute the job that is still going to be there. So voice interaction is really where robotics technology is at right now. And that doesn't necessarily mean voice interaction with a head attached to it. It's actually voice interaction on the smartphone or the Alexa or some other comparatively dumb-looking device. And it needs to be a dumb-looking device, or we expect it to behave better. So this is a kind of idea of the spectrum of social robots. And it's proven over and over again that if the robot looks like that and it can't help you, that's fine. If the robot looks like that and says something that's garbage, then it's not good enough at all. Now, oh, that's why that slide's there. So robots that look or act like humans, peak of hype, overinflated expectations. Robots that look like prehistoric life, like snakes and insects, totally underrated for their utility value. They're going to be awesome. And where the sophistication is happening right now, voice interaction. And we are going to be rolling out voice interaction in all sorts of embodied robots. Yes. Someone raised the issue of encoded bias. Well, to me, this is the nightmare scenario, because we have biased data. We then encode that biased data into algorithm. And it's starting to come out in our voice assistants. Has anyone noticed, I mean, this is the image of Cortana, the Microsoft voice assistant, that Cortana was modeled on. Does anybody have a voice assistant that's male? Where did you get it? How did you tune it? Right, customized, okay? No, never by default. Not only that, but here's the scary part. It isn't just that we're getting female voice assistants by default. This is what they learn by machine learning, because Amazon's Alexa did not have a default female voice. It went through a learning process to develop a voice, and it developed a female voice, okay? So there is a feedback loop that's happening here. And when we embody this, you take your female voice, and of course it goes into a female body. And psychologically, we have a lot of evidence that we respond to a female voice in roles of assistance, being helpful. And we actually respond to a male voice in roles of authority or command. So I was in London recently, and it might not be like this all the time, but I wish I had made a voice recording, because there was a female voice saying, "We're now approaching Hampstead Heath. The next station is going to be something else that I can't remember." And then the male voice would say, "Mind the gap." So you understand that most of these commercial robots are being driven by commercial operations who understand these effects really well. They're not going to try anything tricky or new with us. They are simply going to do what they know works. In terms of design principles, I love this because, you know what, we laugh at C-3PO because it tries so hard to be human and it fails miserably all the time. And that's really, really funny. Whereas R2-D2, who beeps and twirls and has very few human features, is very silly and yet always exceeds our expectations. And we find that very humorous as well. So animators have understood how we interact with artificial creatures for a very long time. And in fact, the Disney animators developed the key principles, the 12 principles of life that are used when you design robots, which are a lot of fun if you go look for that. So animators and artists are actually behind the design of the best robot systems. So there's another little film and television meets robots twist. But these days it's very simple to build robots. And even a simple robot is going to trigger an emotional impact. All you need to do is put 2 eyes on a rock or a cookie, and it suddenly has an expression, an emotion. So, my 5 laws of robotics to compete with Asimov. But I will say that these are actually design guidelines or ethical principles that have come from the EPSRC workshops over the last 6 years, mainly in the UK, but that's a collection of some of the best minds in this. Or what I've done is I've kind of shortened the somewhat academic rules and tried to make them understandable to engineers or investors. So forgive me if they seem a little simple for everyone here. Rule number 1. Yeah, let's not go there. And indeed, you know, there are military systems that are being designed that have no other purpose, but most robotic systems are multi-purposed. Second law, robots should obey the law. Well, there were no traffic laws that could deal with the influx of automobiles in the 20s and 30s. I think it wasn't until sometime in the 20s when the first traffic light intersection was developed. So you did have to create a new set of interactions and rules, and an entire class of jobs came out of this: traffic police, parking restrictions, street design, not to mention mechanics and garages and fuel pump attendants and all of those kind of things. But at the same time, we exist already in a legal framework that is somewhat loose, so that the judicial the judiciary can actually make interpretive decisions based on case law and various interpretations. Now, it happens that there is a whole class of law that applies to devices and products, tort law, for example, but there are also broader laws like privacy law, maybe not so much in the US, but definitely strongly in Europe. And so we have a lot of cultural fears about all those eyes in the sky with drones. But the reality is, if they're recording, they're breaking the law. Now, I'll tell you where this gets tricky, and it isn't so much the spread of drone technology, it's actually the fact that all of those voice assistants, they have to be on all the time to be able to respond to your voice. And if you look at autonomous self-driving vehicles, every sensor that they need, fundamentally need for navigation, is always on, recording everything. Way back when I was still in Australia, there was a bit of a fuss because we discovered that Google was what you call war driving. When they were doing Street View, they were driving around the streets and they were logging everybody's Wi-Fi and whether it was secured or not, and all of that kind of information, which you think, hold on, that's inside my property line. You can't do that. Well, legally you couldn't, but they did it anyway because nobody could tell until somebody did. Okay? But this is where I'm saying this is an overlooked law of robotics because there are laws. And if your technology is by default going to be breaking them, then I think you need to be working fairly hard on designing better and being transparent about it, but that's the next law. This one, again, this worries me more than encoded algorithm bias, because although I don't believe necessarily that software is always easy to update, it is a lot easier than a physical product recall. So if your physical robots are doing the wrong thing, and it might be as simple as wearing out quickly, but maybe it's a really critical part of the robot system that wears out, and then it is dangerous. There are all of these potential issues. And I work with a lot of companies that are less than 3 years old. They simply have not had time to do the level of quality testing that we'd like. Oh, crikey, my timer stopped and I didn't know. We think of robots like that, but really, this is what they look like, or this. And it's a lot harder to recall those physical devices. Finally, this law, robots must not mislead us. With robot traffic increasing, we're going to get robot smog. With robot salespeople, with social robots, we're going to get robot spam. And as I touched on before, we're going to get robot stereotypes. Finally, this is perhaps the most important rule of all. Robots should be transparent, and robots should be identifiable. So that's an extension of transparency. Not only should we be able to unpack what's happening in the black box of the systems and all of those systems that are being off the shelf put together, like, well, I was just using OpenCV, so I guess it didn't recognize women's faces because it's not that good yet, but it wasn't my problem. I just bought it and used it, etc. Those systems to the systems that we honestly don't know what's happening when they're all working together, to the fact that we don't really have a law saying, unlike cars or boats, it must be identifiable. There really are no labels on those robots, which I think poses some rather interesting ethical questions. And I think that this should be one of the fundamental rules that we ask for straight off. Robots should be identifiable. Now I have lots of really exciting videos of new robots that I don't have time to show you, but you have heard probably of YouTube. But I will finish with one in the background. Super cool, that was Alison Okamura. This is Space Robotics New Systems, but I believe that you might even see this in person because this is Arizona University. And I believe this is being tested somewhere not too far away from here. But there are very novel models of construction happening now to allow robots like this to be built for about $70. They're using a lot of simulation to do evolutionary design, like biomimicry is a fascinating field of robotics. Not just simulation in computer or virtually, but with sand pits to test, to get some real kind of answers going against the evolutionary process to say, what do these forms work? Now, interestingly enough, the closer to nature the shape you construct is, the more likely it is to be successful. So I think you'll find that life is influencing the design of robots everywhere, but we have to move past the electromechanical systems, which are inherently different in how they're designed. And we're starting to see soft robotics, bendable robotics, cheap robotics, inflatable robotics. You might have seen my favorite robot documentary, Big Hero 6. Okay, this is modeled on real-life research robots, which I can't show you yet, but Andrew Ng says that AI is the new electricity. It isn't, because without those robots to become the data collection, derricks, the devices by which we develop the AI, the devices by which we capture the data, then I don't believe we're able to have the impact on the world that we want from something as fundamentally game-changing as what we're doing in AI. So robots can change the world for the better, and we need them to, because we need to solve things like food security. We need to solve things like aging population, and we can make better environmental choices if we have more efficient processes that require less input and less output. So ultimately, I think we need to change our physical world infrastructure that has to involve robotic systems. And just to finish off there, where I came from the start is I believe that being an older, these days, woman in robotics gives me a perspective that I don't really see that often in the room. And I truthfully believe that if there were more diversity in the room, then we would be designing these new and different systems of robots faster. We need to maximize the innovation potential in our society, not simply keep going down the same path that the homogeneous group says is the path to follow. So we need people who are willing to challenge the stereotypes. And I think if you come from a diverse perspective to start off with, then you're much, much more advanced in terms of being able to create more interesting and more socially useful technologies. Thank you. So,
Okay, thank you very much. We are running a little behind with the program because the students have to go somewhere else after that. So, but we'll still be able to take a couple of questions at least for the presentation.
Cool. And I'm very happy to answer questions online in other fashions. So I'm sure my email can be made available.
Okay, I just want to say I'm currently studying chemical engineering at ASU. With a focus in K through 12 STEM education with the Grand Challenge Scholars Program. I've got to ask this question to a lot of professors and engineers, but I've never gotten to ask an actual woman engineer. So I wanted to ask, what does the idea of diversity in STEM mean to you? And how can we get more students of diverse backgrounds to pursue STEM?
Okay. Pay them and promote them. We fix those two things, we fix everything. I think a lot of people think that because there are no women in engineering, women need to get the message back in kindergarten that engineering is a good idea. I will speak for the fact that I thought it was a fantastic idea until I discovered that I wasn't welcome and that my contributions would perpetually be undervalued and that I would not be paid at the same rate and that I would not be promoted. And I think what we see is not a lack of women going into STEM, but we want smart women in STEM, and smart women notice the fact that nobody else is in there. You know, we need to change that. And I think we need to start at the top. We need to have more heads of departments who are women. We need to have more CEOs who are women. We need to have more investors who are women. And we need them to have the same pay scale as we've just seen in Hollywood, where, well, that's just the way it is. Women get paid less than 1/10 of their male partners.
Hi, I just want to bring in the second rule that you mentioned, and you said that robots must obey laws. And so I was wondering, what does that mean for the legal responsibility of companies? And do you think changes have to be made to pre-existing legal systems, or do you think that we should just interpret laws differently to apply to robotics?
Yeah, there is a nice amount of employment for legal scholars who are already discussing things like what are the nuances around self-driving trucks and cars, for example. That's been going on for 10 years. Yet some of the best legal scholars look at the work of Ryan Calo and Bryant Walker-Smith and Kate Darling and a couple of others whose names escape me right now, but they're saying the framework exists. And where is the incentive to develop the applications of this? Actually in the insurance industry. And you can guarantee that they are working on it.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to have to stop here. Thank you so much again.